Hey guys, what's up? It's me, Kari, and we're trying recording in landscape view again. I don't know, it just doesn't look right to me anymore. It's really weird. I know it probably fills your TV or whatever, your tablet's better this way, but I'm kind of used to recording in portrait mode now, so let me know in the comments down below which you guys prefer, because that's what I'll stick with. Obviously, I want it to look better for you guys, but yeah, this feels awkward. I haven't shot this way in a really long time. But anyway, okay, we're getting back to our book, Homecoming by Cynthia Voigt. We're getting close to the end now, guys. We have like, I think less than 50 pages left. Holy crap. But anyway, this is chapter 9. So here we go. Actually, hold on. I like to flip just to make sure we have enough time to do each chapter. I usually do this before I get on camera. This may be another long one, so we may have to break this chapter into 2 parts. We'll see how it goes. I don't like these to go more longer than like 20 minutes, 25 minutes, but anyway. That was a minute of babbling. Here we go. Daisy woke herself up early the next morning, before the first gray signals of dawn, when the air outside lay black over fields, marshes, and the glistening water she could just see from her window. For a time she sat by the window and thought out the plan she had gone to sleep considering. It all depended on what their grandmother was really like, inside herself, where she was who she really was, not outside. Daisy knew about the difference between outside and inside. You could assume that everybody wasn't just the way they seemed. The question was, in what way was their grandmother not what she seemed? Did she really want the Tillermans to go away? Daisy was sure that she didn't want the Tillermans to stay, but Daisy wasn't sure she wanted them to go away. Their grandmother was a Tillerman too, which made everything contradictory. If she wanted the Tillermans to go, then she wanted herself to go. In a contradictory way, this was true. Daisy's job was to see through the contradictions and find out where they made sense together. Why had their grandmother gone outside to the back when Daisy knocked? She could have stayed inside and not been found. Why had she asked all those questions at dinner? Cousin Eunice's letter would have explained about Mama. And what did she mean when she said to Daisy that she knew what Daisy was thinking? Unless it was what she herself was thinking. Besides, their grandmother had taken the boat to town to find James and Maybeth and Sammy. That was something she wouldn't have done if she really wanted them to go away. Maybe their grandmother didn't know just what she wanted. Or maybe she didn't really want anything except to be left alone. 4 kids, they were an awful bother. Cousin Eunice said so again and again. And an expense. Daisy could manage the bother, and they'd figure out a way to cover the expenses. She was sure they could do that. They could leave their grandmother pretty much alone. It was the place Daisy wanted. The big house, the acres of farmland, the barn, the water, and the boat. It didn't have anything to do with the woman. The sky lightened. Over in the east, behind the house, the last star would be fading as the sun surged up. Above the marshes, a pale quarter moon waited in a light blue sky, with mares' tails clouds brushing against it. Time to get moving. Daisy woke James and Sammy and Maybeth. They all met in Daisy's room over the kitchen, so that any noise they made wouldn't waken their grandmother. Daisy explained her plan. We have to get started on something useful before she wakes up. That way she'll keep us here today. Or if she tells us to go, we can say we will as soon as we finish the job. But, James said, but what? But what if she means it? She does mean it, Daisy said. That's the trouble, isn't it? I figure if we get her to put it off, she'll just get used to us and forget that she wants us to go away. We pretend we're not even thinking about staying here. Every day we do something that needs to be done, so it's worth her while to keep us. She could call the police, James said. She doesn't have a phone, but if she does, then we'll go. I promise. If she really does mean it. Can't you tell? She doesn't want us to stay, but she doesn't want us to go either. I don't think she likes me, Sammy said. That doesn't matter, Sammy. It's not her I'm thinking about, it's us. Right. That's right, Sid. Can you see him back there? Oh, you can't see him. It's too high, but you can hear him. She's mean, Sammy said. She's not like Mama at all. That doesn't matter, Daisy repeated. Besides, she's not really mean. Not like Mr. Rudyard, is she? How do you know? Sammy demanded. Remember when James took that money, Maybeth asked him? Remember how Daisy's face got all red and hot, and she told us we had to go, and she told James he had to obey? Remember? That was like our grandmother. Mr. Rudyard was cold. Sammy subsided. Excuse me. Daisy took advantage of the moment to announce their project for the day, honeysuckle. They dressed quietly, used the bathroom quickly, and tiptoed down the stairs into the dark hall. The kitchen lay in shadows. They began with the honeysuckle growing up around the front porch. It had formed a massed wall that wove around itself and clung to itself with tiny tendrils. The tendrils looped and looped around anything that would hold them up. The Tillermans had no plan. They just reached into the plants and pulled. The honeysuckle vines emerged in long stringers unwoven from the mass. By the time the sun had risen and only the shadow of the paper mulberry tree kept an early morning coolness over the yard, they had a large mound of honeysuckle branches at the foot of the lawn. Daisy didn't know how they were going to get rid of it. In some patches she could see the screen on the porch, but they hadn't gotten a quarter of the growth yet. Maybe it would burn, but she doubted that. It was lush summer growth, tensile vines and green leaves. "I'm hungry," James said. "This is going to take all day." "I hope so," Dicey grunted, jerking back on a fat vine. "Anyway, let's see what there is to eat." They trooped around the side of the house and across the porch. At the kitchen door they stopped. Their grandmother was up. She was at the stove making pancakes on a griddle so large it covered 2 burners on the stove. She turned around when she heard them coming in. "Wash your hands. I see that you don't make your beds." "I'll do that," Dicey offered. "No, you'll each do your own," that grandmother said. She turned her back on them. She was wearing another shapeless blouse over another long, shapeless skirt. Her feet were bare and clean. She had set the table. When the children sat down, 2 platters of pancakes waited for them. There was no syrup or butter, but quart jars of strawberry jam were set out. Their grandmother didn't say a word. She just served herself 2 pancakes and spread jam over them. The pancakes looked normal, but they tasted curiously flat. The jam, however, was delicious, and the children ate with good appetites. Sorry, itchy nose. Finally, their grandmother spoke. "I like that honeysuckle." She looked at Dicey. Dicey's heart sank. "That honeysuckle's been there a long time. It's the kind of tenacious plant I have to respect," their grandmother said. "Honeysuckle is parasitic," James announced. "It can be trained and kept back, but when allowed to proliferate without controls, it chokes out other growth. It's begun to climb over the small trees out front." The grandmother studied him. James ignored her and slathered jam on his 7th pancake. "Where'd you learn a word like proliferate?" she asked him. His mouth was full so he couldn't answer. "The honeysuckle will take you all day, at least," their grandmother said. Nobody answered. Dicey tried to look unconcerned with what her grandmother would say next. "You can't just leave those vines piled up. They have to go out on the marsh," was what she said. Dicey chewed hard to keep herself from smiling. This was just a skirmish, not even a real battle. She looked up to meet her grandmother's eyes and swallowed hastily. After the dishes were washed and the beds made, the children went back outside. The temperature had gone up, and they stripped down to just their shorts. This meant that as they pulled the vines or piled them up, they got mightily scratched, all over their arms and chests and legs, but it was cooler. They sang as they worked, sometimes in harmony, sometimes all singing melody. Dicey showed Maybeth how to wrap a long vine around her arm and pull back on it with all her weight, taking the strain in her shoulder. Sammy used both his hands. Half the time he jerked so hard that he fell over backwards. The overgrowth gradually gave way to a thin layer of the oldest, thickest vines. These had to be worked out of the screen netting because if you pulled hard on them, the screen ripped out. As they stood, patiently unraveling coiled tendrils, Dicey began to sing the song about the wide river and the small boat. She liked the way the melody held its notes and lingered over its phrases. This was a song they all sang together, but each of them sang it his own way, holding the notes and words he liked best. The voice came from behind them. "Where'd you hear that song?" They turned, wiping back sweat-dampened hair. Their grandmother had cut a cantaloupe up into thick slices. She had arranged the slices on a metal cookie sheet. "Mama sang it," James answered her. "Is that for us?" "I don't have lemons for lemonade," she said. "Don't have milk, eggs, butter. It's melons or nothing." "Melons are fine, thanks," Dicey said quickly. "Did you sing to our mama?" Maybeth asked. "I don't recall," their grandmother said. She walked away from them back around the house. The children ignored her and fell upon the melons. As they sat and ate, Dicey looked at what they had accomplished. "We can finish the front and clear away around the trees. Then we'll eat lunch, okay?" They agreed. "And after that, we'll move that pile of vines down to the marsh. I guess it might be safe to burn them there. And after that, how does a long swim sound?" A long swim sounded fine. When they went into the kitchen for lunch, their grandmother was not there. They couldn't call out to her because they didn't know what name they were supposed to use. It sounded funny to say Mrs. Tillerman, and it sounded just as funny to say grandmother. Dicey knocked on the closed door of the downstairs bedroom, but there was no answer. Because Dicey didn't feel right about going into the refrigerator or the pantry, they ate tomatoes and cucumbers from the garden. As soon as they were finished, they jumped up to carry huge armloads of tangled vines out to the marsh. Dicey decided that the pile should be a good way into the marsh, but next to the path, so they didn't have to tramp through the wet grasses. It made quite a hill, big enough to slide down if it had been hay. Dicey didn't want to light a fire without checking with their grandmother. She didn't feel sure of what would happen when the leaves caught, so they left the vines and ran down to the water, single file, along the narrow path. They tossed their shorts and sneakers on the end of the dock and leaped into the water. It was cool and cleansing. It washed the sweat off their bodies. They stretched muscles that were taut and tired from pulling and carrying. Dicey swam underwater, looking at the muddy bottom. The water soaked through her hair and cooled her head. She rolled and floated underwater as if she were a piece of seaweed. After a while, she climbed out and sat on the dock. It was then that she realized the boat was gone. What was their grandmother up to? The children lay on the dock, letting the hot sun dry them. "We ought to trim back that honeysuckle by the barn," James said. He was lying on his back in the puddle made by the water dripping off of him. His eyes were closed tight against the bright sunlight. "She says she likes honeysuckle, didn't she? If we trimmed it, it would make kind of a hedge, and it wouldn't harm anything." "We don't have anything to cut it with," Dicey said. "You could ask." "No, I can't. Don't you see? We can't ask. We just have to do things. We can't give her a chance to say no, because if we do, then that's what she'll say. And we've got to get back to work. There are still the side porches. I've got to look in the barn for tools, because the next job is to fix the screens on the porches." Dicey sprang up and put on her shorts. She hurried her family along. James and Maybeth and Sammy pulled at the honeysuckle on the side near the barn, while Dicey explored the cobwebby barn inside. She forced the doors wide apart so she would have enough light to see. She found a small workshop opposite the empty stalls. The tools looked clean and well oiled: saws, hammers, pliers, axes, mallets, planes, drills, screwdrivers, a level. No cobwebs had spun around the workbench, so she figured her grandmother kept it in order. Nearby garden tools hung on the wall and lay on a long shelf: clippers in 4 different sizes, shovels, hoes, stiff metal rakes, and long-fingered leaf rakes. A tiny cupboard with 3 dozen small drawers held nails and screws of every size. Dicey did not let herself linger by the boat. The boat was the prize. Unless they could stay, she wouldn't think about fixing it up or sailing it. She hoisted herself up onto the side and checked under the bow to be sure the sails in the canvas pack were there. Then she picked out the 2 largest pairs of clippers and ran outside. James and Maybeth began the slow task of trimming back the honeysuckle hedge. Sammy didn't want to. He enjoyed tearing down the vines, grabbing at them with both hands and holding hard as his hands slipped down, ripping off the leaves. Then when his grip held, he would lean back on the vine and swing his weight against it. He grunted as he pulled. He braced his sturdy little legs against the ground. Sammy was hard to stop once he'd made up his mind to do a job. Dicey saw their grandmother walking through the vegetable fields, carrying 2 large grocery bags. She called to James to go take them, or at least one, and continued pulling. The next time she looked, her grandmother was walking along, still carrying 2 bags, and James was nowhere in sight. Dicey let go of the vine in exasperation and ran to help. She met her grandmother at the end of the lawn. She didn't even ask, she just took a bag. "Front must be clear by the size of that pile out in the marsh," the woman said. Their grandmother came around the side to inspect the work. Sammy decided he should show off. He leaned back and grunted to show how hard he was working. He jerked his arms. His whole body pulled back against the vine. The vine snapped free of the roof. Sammy tumbled backwards onto his fanny. His feet flew up in the air. The vine came after him and wrapped around him as if it had a life of its own, as if it was a boa constrictor attacking its dinner. Their grandmother laughed, a thin, rusty sound. Sammy struggled to free his head and arms from the snaky leaves. "What's so funny?" he demanded. "You are," his grandmother said, and Sammy laughed too. James came up from the marsh carrying 2 more bags of groceries. "Can she use clippers?" the woman asked Dicey when she saw Maybeth. "Is it safe for her?" This irritated Dicey. "Ask her yourself. She's not deaf, if you can't see for yourself." "Well, you'd better rub the tools down carefully with the tack cloth before you put them away, or they'll rust. I have groceries to put away." They swam again before dinner. They came to the table with wet heads and shining faces. Their grandmother had fried pieces of chicken and a thin cornbread batter. She served mashed potatoes with butter and pools on the top and green beans. She even had dessert, a store cake with stiff, oversweet chocolate frosting and a bowl of apples and bananas. By each child's plate stood a tall glass of milk. You did a good day's work, their grandmother said. I suppose you'll be moving on tomorrow? Daisy took a deep breath. There's still honeysuckle to be pulled. I don't know why you carried it so far into the marsh, their grandmother said. You could leave it up to the near end, and it'll rot away by spring. James, you look like you could use another piece of chicken. It's not what she said, but what she didn't say, that Dicey heard. The Tillermans had won another day. After supper, the children washed up the dishes, and their grandmother went out to the fields. As Maybeth soaked and rinsed, and the boys dried, and Dicey put away the glasses, put away the glasses, dishes, knives, forks, pots, and pans, they sang. Maybeth scrubbed down the wooden table, and Dicey polished it dry. Maybeth sang the song about the man who sang for his dead friends. The others had forgotten the words, so she taught them again. Their voices blended in the yellow kitchen light and filled the empty house as the world outside darkened into twilight. When I come across to the cross of that silent sea, who will sing for me? They let the echoes of the melody fade away before they moved again. I'll give you this much, their grandmother said from the doorway. Your mama taught you how to sing. She stood with darkness behind her. Daisy couldn't read her expression. Where'd you hear that song? A friend taught it to us, someone we met when we were going to Aunt Scylla's house, Dicey said. Stuart, Maybeth said. Stuart who? Their grandmother asked. I don't know, Dicey said. It was at a college. What were you doing at a college? Their grandmother asked. James told her about their time in New Haven. He started with the rain and the hunger. He even told about stealing the money. He finished it at the beach in Fairfield. Their grandmother had stood silent in the doorway while he told it. You're not helpless infants, she remarked. Then she added quickly, if you want to wash anything, tonight's the time. I'm canning tomorrow and the next week. Daisy washed out their dirty underwear in the sink. She stumbled through the dark outside to the far side of the house, the side they hadn't yet pulled honeysuckle from, to find the clothesline. Mosquitoes bit at her, but she lingered outside anyway, listening to the wind in the pines and the frogs croaking across the marsh. Overhead, between the branches of the trees, stars shone. Clouds drifted across the moon's partial face. When she returned to the kitchen, it was dark and empty. She ran up the stairs 2 at a time to join her family. That was how the first day went. On the second day, they pulled down the rest of the honeysuckle on both sides of the house and gathered all the piles together near the edge of the marsh. In the afternoon, James and Dicey started patching up the holes in the porch screens, where the screens had pulled out or the wood had just ripped. Pulled out of the wood or just ripped, Their grandmother spent the whole day in the kitchen, canning batches of tomatoes and carrying them out to cool on the back porch. Sammy and Maybeth emptied the crab pots for supper, and they ate at the trestle table on the porch. Some crabs were left over. Even James couldn't fit any more in. So Maybeth picked out the meat and put it in a bowl in the refrigerator for lunch the next day. I guess she'll be moving on tomorrow, their grandmother said again. There's still screens to be patched, Dicey said. Did you bait the traps, the woman asked Sammy and Maybeth. They had. That was how the second day went. On the third day, they finished the screens, and James set to work mending the front steps, with Maybeth to give him an extra hand. Sammy and Dicey mopped and waxed the floors inside. They even went into the dark dining room, which had a big table and 8 chairs and a fireplace at one end, and the living room. Dicey snapped up the shades and looked around there. This room, too, had a fireplace and a sofa in front of it, and a huge wooden desk with walls full of books. Dicey called James in to see it. A few of the books he'd read, some he'd heard of. The rest he stood and looked at. You could read for years, he said. Who wants to? Sammy asked him. Hurry up so I can go swimming. At dinner, James asked their grandmother about the books. My husband was a reading man, she said, for all the good it did him. What do you mean? James asked. He got all of his answers out of books, their grandmother said. Books don't change, and he liked that. They made him feel right. What's the matter with that? James wanted to know. You can study books and think about what's in them. People put down what happened before you were even born, and you can understand and not make the same mistakes, like history. The past is gone, their grandmother said. But it shouldn't be forgotten, James said, should it? Sometimes, their grandmother said. Sometimes it's better. My husband used his books to build a wall to keep things out. Oh, I know, she cut off James's answer. I know it doesn't have to be that way, but that's the way it was. Books let things in, James said. His grandmother studied him. I guess they could, for some. They didn't, not for him. But he knew a lot about history and ideas and the way things should be. James was listening carefully, but she changed the subject. Will you be moving on tomorrow? When the front hinges are set in, Dicey said, your mailbox needs bracing, and there's some patching to be done on the barn. You have lumber in there, don't you? It's going to rain there, Grandmother said. There's storms brewing. Dicey's heart fell. That night, Dicey was awakened by thunder roaring about the house. Lightning snaked out of a black sky. She started counting the end of the thunder and barely got to 2 when lightning flashed again. Maybeth entered her room. Dicey? Climb in. It's right over our heads, Maybeth said. It certainly seemed to be. Thunder growled just outside the window, trying to get in. Lightning flashed down and cracked like a whip. Dicey reached for Maybeth's hand, and they tiptoed down the hallway and down the stairs. In the kitchen, Dicey turned on the light. Maybeth stood by the door, pale. Come on, sit down, Dicey urged her. I didn't know you were afraid of thunderstorms. Don't worry. Lightning goes for the highest thing, so it'll hit a tree or one of the chimneys, not us. She reached out and pulled at Maybeth's right hand. The little girl winced and turned paler. She pulled back and rubbed at her arm by the elbow. The arm hung down by her side as if it were a broken wing. Maybeth? Dicey asked. What's wrong with your arm? It hurts. It hurts when I close my hand into a fist or try to hold something. Sometimes it just hurts when I don't do anything. It woke me up. I don't know what's wrong, Dicey. Maybe it'll go away by itself, Dicey said. She poured Maybeth a glass of milk and got one for herself. They sat and drank quietly. Maybeth held the glass awkwardly in her left hand. The sky outside exploded with rain. It pounded on the tin roof of the porch. After a while, the 2 girls went quietly upstairs again. There was a bar of light under their grandmother's bedroom door. Dicey wondered if she was afraid of storms. Mama wasn't. The morning of the 4th day dawned low and dark. The thunderstorm had passed, but the rain poured steadily down. It drummed on the roof. It splattered on the ground. It rattled softly among the trees. Dicey stood by the window looking west. A low gray mist covered the marshes, and you couldn't see the bay. They couldn't work outside in the rain, but surely their grandmother wouldn't ask them to leave on a day like this. But then why shouldn't she? What did she care? Dicey stood watching rain fall in sheets. The barn! They could clean out the barn. She woke her brothers and sister. They dressed quietly, and quietly they went to the bathroom and washed the sleep from their eyes and brushed their teeth. Quietly they went down the stairs and into the kitchen. Their grandmother, already dressed in shirt and skirt, stood by the sink. She was running water into a canning pot. Glass jars stood on the draining board. A bushel basket of tomatoes was on the kitchen table. The woman's hair was damp and curled wildly, her feet caked with mud. Caught, the children could only wait. You could help me, the woman said. Her eyes were bright, but her face sagged with fatigue. I need the ripe tomatoes picked and the squashes and cukes that are all along the ground. The drainage is bad, so they'll rot if we don't get them in. The children took off their sneakers and shirts and left them by the porch door. Dicey and James carried a towering pile of bushel baskets. They stepped out into the rain. The drops of water hammered down on them like a shower at full force. They bent their heads and ran for the field. The long grass was wet and cold against their legs. They were soaked before they reached the field. Dicey told James and Maybeth to tackle the tomatoes. She showed Sammy where the cucumbers were and went back to the squashes herself. Mud oozed up through her toes as her feet sank into the earth. She worked as fast as she could around the mounds where zucchini and yellow squashes spread out. The squashes were hidden under leaves larger than her hand. Dicey knelt down into the chilly mud and picked them out. She tossed them into the basket beside her. The rain beat down on her bare back. Her wet shorts chafed against her waist and thighs. They might as well have taken off all their clothes, she thought. In spite of her discomfort, she worked fast. Once she looked over to see how James and Maybeth were doing. When she checked on Sammy, she saw that he had taken off his shorts and underpants and was standing stark naked over the cucumber plants. Sometimes, she thought, he has more sense than any of us. Dicey carried the 2 baskets she and Sammy filled back to the porch without going inside. She ran to help finish the tomatoes. Sammy's fanny gleamed white on his tan body as he stooped over to pick beside Maybeth. Maybeth was using only her left hand. She held her right arm stiff by her side. James and Dicey carried the full baskets back. Maybeth ran ahead inside. Sammy didn't want to go in. He ran about in long grass of the lawn. He turned cartwheels and the rain droned down around him. When Dicey came up with the last basket, she saw him rolling about in the long grass like a dog. His face was bright, entirely happy. She looked past him and saw their grandmother standing to hold the porch door open for James, who struggled with the steps with the basket of tomatoes in his arms. The woman was watching Sammy with a smile in her eyes. Their grandmother seemed to have a smile as sudden and complete as laughter. I'm going to try to finish this chapter, guys. I'm trying to read faster, but if it cuts off, please forgive me. There's like 4 or 5 pages left. Daisy called Sammy in. Maybeth had dressed and sat quietly at the table, nursing her arm. Daisy ran the boys upstairs to dry off and change clothes. The table was set for breakfast when they came down. The huge pot steamed and rattled as the glass jars boiled, to be sterile for the day's canning. Their grandmother served them bowls of hot oatmeal with brown sugar and milk to put on it. Daisy sat beside Maybeth. "It still hurts?" she asked. Maybeth just nodded. She held the spoon in her left hand and ate sloppily. Daisy realized that she shouldn't have let Maybeth come out picking with them. She didn't know what could be wrong. What was it like when your arm was broken? How could Maybeth have broken her arm? Their grandmother stormed up from the table and threw a dishcloth across at Maybeth. Oh, I missed a line, sorry. Maybeth reached across the cereal bowl for the pitcher of milk. She tried to pour it over her cereal, but it splashed onto the table. Their grandmother stormed up from the table and threw a dishcloth across at Maybeth. "Can't you even feed yourself? Mop it up." Maybeth mopped at the milk and knocked at her bowl. Daisy caught it before it spilled. "What's the matter with her?" their grandmother demanded. Maybeth's face was white, and she stared at her cereal. Daisy mopped up the spilled milk. She touched Maybeth softly on the left shoulder to let her know that she wasn't angry. "Answer me," their grandmother said. "Or is this the way she usually is, and it's all been an act until now?" "Something's wrong with her arm," Daisy said. "What's something?" The woman sat down and began eating again. "I don't know," Daisy said. "It hurts." Their grandmother turned her attention to Maybeth. "How long has it hurt?" "Since yesterday morning," Maybeth said. "Why didn't you say?" Daisy asked, exasperated. Maybeth shrugged. Daisy subsided because she knew why Maybeth hadn't said anything. "What does it feel like?" their grandmother asked. "It hurts. It feels burny and achy. When I close my hand and try to hold something, it's like a fire going up around my elbow." Maybeth swallowed. "It's getting worse, not better." Their grandmother stormed up from the table and out of the room. The Tillermans looked at one another, surprised. "Maybe she doesn't like people being sick," Daisy said. But the woman returned with a jar of ointment and a broad roll of gauze bandaging. She rubbed the ointment into Maybeth's elbow and down her forearm. Then she made a tight bracelet around Maybeth's wrist, ripping off the gauze with her teeth and tying it into a knot. She made another such bandage above the little girl's elbow. "Probably a tendon," she announced. "Does that help?" Maybeth nodded. "It sounds like you pulled a tendon in your arm. Pulling down that honeysuckle, it doesn't surprise me. You'll have to take it easy with that arm for weeks. The bandages will ease the strain on the muscle." "Thank you," Maybeth said. "You should have spoken up sooner," her grandmother answered. "No need to bear pain unless you have to." Maybeth nodded. "I was afraid it wouldn't ever feel better," she said. "Tendons can be pretty bad," their grandmother answered. "What are your plans for the day?" she asked Daisy. There was a challenge in her words. "Clean out the barn," Daisy said. "Not without sunlight. It's dark as a tomb in there," the woman answered. She waited, her eyes snapping. "We'll wash windows," Daisy said. "In the rain?" "It's not raining inside." Her grandmother nodded. "I could use some help in the kitchen." Daisy washed off the tomatoes. James cut them up, and Maybeth ladled them awkwardly into jars with her left hand. Sammy got down some old towels and ripped them into cloths. Their grandmother put the tops on the jars and set them into the canning pot. "You know those old houses in town?" James said. "Who owns them?" "Rich people. There was a time when Chrisfield was a boom town," their grandmother said. "People made fortunes in oysters and crabs and built big houses." "What happened?" James said. "The usual," his grandmother said. "There was a lot of money and a lot of crime, gambling and drinking, and people killing one another in one way or another. So the town tried to clean itself up. They passed a law against whiskey, and that had the usual result." "Bootlegging? Moonshining?" James asked. She nodded. "And the oysters had a few bad seasons. There were no more fortunes to be made here, legally or illegally. So people left. The trains stopped running. And when I was a girl, this was quite a town. Not like it is now." "Did you know any bootleggers?" James asked. "On the water with boats? There must have been a lot of it around here." "I suppose I did," their grandmother said. "But they had been doing it for so long." "Prohibition didn't last that long," James said. "Around here it did. It started in 1875, and that was before my time. Long before, in case you think of asking. There were families that had been bootlegging for 2 or 3 generations." "Why did it start so early?" James asked. His eyes began to gleam, and Daisy knew that he would pick information from the woman's brain as long as she would answer his questions. Daisy filled a bucket with water and ammonia and took Sammy upstairs with her to wash windows. They soaped the glass down with sponges and dried it with the pieces of towels. By mid-morning, Sammy's restlessness had grown too large for the house to contain him. Daisy had worked slowly, dragging out the chore, but Sammy didn't see any sense in this. By 2 o'clock, by the clock that ticked on the mantel in the living room, he was ready to quit. Daisy told him he couldn't. He had to be useful. Sammy thought for a minute, then ran down the hallway to the kitchen. Daisy had polished dry all the windows before she wondered where he was. He'd been gone an hour. He wasn't in the kitchen. He wasn't upstairs. Daisy ran out to the barn, but he wasn't in the gloom there either. She came inside again. Only her grandmother was in the kitchen, sitting with a cup of tea at the table while the 2 canning pots rattled on the stove. A huge bowl of cut squashes stood ready to be canned next. "Did you see Sammy?" Daisy asked. "He ran through a while back, more than an hour. The other 2 were in the living room." Daisy heard the faint noises of the piano. "I'm going down to the dock to look for him," Daisy said. "He's been gone too long." "He didn't say where he was going?" their grandmother asked. Daisy shook her head. "That boy needs some controlling, doesn't he? Your cousin said that." "She didn't approve of us, Daisy said. She wanted Sammy to be like James. Only James isn't like what she thought either. She just liked him because people praised her about him. And Maybeth, she wanted her to be a doll, a dressed-up doll to take places. Sammy wasn't easy enough for her, and that's why she said that." "What about you?" her grandmother asked. "I don't know," Daisy said. "I never thought about it. I was busy. Busy sneaking out to earn money and never saying a thing to her about it." Daisy bit back her anger. "She thinks we're not grateful enough, doesn't she?" "Something like that. She says it's her duty, though, to take care of you. I've never seen such a foolish letter. She wrote me another one when her mother died." "You didn't answer it?" "I couldn't answer such silliness. I'll have to write to her now." Daisy stared at her grandmother. She wasn't going to ask any questions. Her grandmother looked tired. "You were awake during the storm," Daisy said. "So were you and Maybeth. Were you scared?" Daisy shook her head. Maybeth's arm hurt and it woke her up. "Were you scared?" "It's nothing to be frightened of in a thunderstorm. I was thinking, with 4 children in the house, the only time you can feel alone is at night." Sammy burst into the kitchen. His hair was plastered down over his forehead. His shirt and shorts were sodden. He dripped onto the floor. "Where have you been?" Daisy demanded. Before he could answer, she ran to get towels. When she returned, her grandmother was in the middle of a lecture. "Running off without telling anyone where you're going? Your sister was worried." "You weren't, were you?" Sammy said. His grandmother shook her head. "Then why are you yelling at me about it?" His grandmother stared at him. Sammy's jaw stuck out, and he stared right back at her. Daisy handed him a towel. "Don't be rude, Sammy," she said. "But it's the truth," he protested. She dried his hair for him, and his voice came out muffled from beneath the terry cloth. "I'm sorry, Daisy. I thought I'd break something if I stayed inside. I was down at the dock. I bailed out the boat so the motor wouldn't get covered with water. Then I checked the crab pots. The water doesn't have any waves." "Because there's no wind," Daisy said. "Next time, tell me where you're going, okay?" "Okay," Sammy answered. Daisy knew Sammy. He wouldn't do things for politeness or because he was told. He would obey if he loved you and knew you loved him. You could trust Sammy. "Go get into dry clothes and hang up the towels," she said. Her grandmother was looking at her. "Doesn't he get punished?" she asked. Daisy wanted to go along with her,